The Texas night stretched long and quiet, the air thick with the warmth of late summer. Outside, the trees stood still, their branches unmoving under the weight of a starless sky. The suburban neighborhood, normally humming with the distant sounds of cars and late-night chatter, had settled into silence. The only sound inside the modest one-story home was the soft ticking of a clock and the faint rustling of the wind against the windows. In the dim glow of the nightlight, Emily sat on the edge of the couch, cradling a baby blanket in her hands. She wasn't even aware she was gripping it so tightly, her fingers curling into the fabric as if she could hold on to something she was losing. Her heart ached as she looked toward the nursery where her 6-month-old son, Caleb, lay still in his crib, just as he had every night since the day he was born. Caleb had never wiggled his toes in excitement, never reached for her when she leaned over his crib, never kicked his tiny feet the way babies do when they're discovering the world. His body had been unresponsive since birth, the victim of a neurological disorder that no doctor had been able to explain or cure. It was as if his body had given up before he ever had a chance to live. James sat across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands pressed against his forehead. He had always been the strong one, the steady force in their home, the one who kept pushing forward even when everything felt like it was crumbling. But even he was beginning to break. She could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way his breath came heavier at the end of each day, the way he barely spoke anymore because words had long since lost their meaning. They had tried everything: specialists, experimental treatments, therapies that promised the impossible. But every appointment ended the same way. A doctor shaking their head, offering nothing but sympathy, telling them to accept that their son might never move, never sit up, never crawl, never walk. Emily couldn't accept it. She refused to. But every night, as she watched Caleb sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, she felt that refusal slip further away. At their feet, a pair of dark eyes watched them closely. Zeus, their 2-year-old Pitbull, lay stretched out on the floor, his large head resting on his paws. He had been with them for a little over a year now, rescued from a shelter by James after being found abandoned on the outskirts of town. Despite the harsh reputation of his breed, Zeus had never been anything but gentle, especially with Caleb. From the moment they brought their son home from the hospital, Zeus had attached himself to the crib like a guardian, refusing to be anywhere else. Most nights he curled up just outside the nursery, his body pressed against the crib's wooden frame, as if he could somehow protect the baby inside. Tonight, however, something was different. Emily noticed it first. Zeus wasn't lying beside the crib like he usually did. He wasn't stretched out in his usual relaxed manner. Instead, he was sitting upright, his ears perked, his body stiff, his gaze locked on the nursery doorway. She frowned. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James looked up, following her gaze to the dog. He straightened slightly, noticing the way Zeus's muscles tensed, his tail motionless, his entire body alert. "What's wrong, boy?" James asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Zeus didn't move. He didn't even blink. The air inside the house felt suddenly heavier, as if something unseen had settled over them. A strange, uneasy feeling curled in Emily's stomach, though she couldn't explain why. She turned toward the baby monitor sitting on the coffee table. The screen cast a faint glow, showing a grainy image of Caleb lying motionless in his crib, just as he always did. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet Zeus remained tense, unmoving, watching. A shiver ran down her spine. James exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "It's late," he muttered. "We should try to get some sleep." Emily nodded absently, but her gaze lingered on Zeus. The Pitbull had never acted this way before. He was protective, yes, but he had never looked like this. He wasn't growling or pacing, but there was something in his stance, something in his stillness, that made her uneasy. She hesitated before standing, glancing at the baby monitor once more before heading toward the nursery. She just needed to see Caleb with her own eyes, just needed to reassure herself that everything was fine. James followed, rubbing the back of his neck as they stepped into the nursery. The room was cool, the soft glow of the nightlight casting long shadows on the pale blue walls. The crib sat against the far wall, its white bars framing the small, still figure inside. Caleb lay exactly as he had when she put him down hours ago. His tiny fists were curled near his chest, his breathing slow and steady. Nothing had changed. Emily let out a slow breath, but the unease in her chest remained. Zeus padded in behind them, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. He approached the crib, his movements slow, deliberate. He lowered his head, sniffing the air, then let out a quiet whine. Emily's pulse quickened. "What is it?" she murmured, kneeling beside him, her fingers brushing through his fur. Zeus didn't respond. He simply stared at Caleb, his ears twitching as if listening to something she couldn't hear. James let out a tired chuckle. "Maybe he just wants to be closer to him," he said. "You know how he gets." Emily nodded, but she wasn't convinced. Zeus had always been close to Caleb, always protective. But this felt different. It felt like he was waiting for something. She reached into the crib, running a gentle hand over Caleb's small, still fingers. They were warm, soft, but motionless, just as they always were. She sighed, brushing a kiss against his forehead before standing. "Come on," she whispered, stepping back. "Let's get some rest." James agreed, and they left the nursery, Zeus still sitting beside the crib, watching over the baby as he had every night before. Emily climbed into bed, exhaustion finally weighing her down, but her mind wouldn't let go of the image of Zeus, of the way he had sat there, so still, so focused. Something about it unsettled her. And as she drifted toward sleep, a thought surfaced, quiet, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. What if Zeus knew something they didn't? What if something was about to change? What if tonight wasn't like every other night? The unusual signs from Zeus. The night was eerily still, thick with an unspoken tension that neither Emily nor James could quite name. A soft wind whispered against the windows, rattling the old wooden frame ever so slightly, but inside the house, everything remained deathly quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't the comforting silence that usually settled over their home once Caleb had been put to bed. It was a silence that felt unnatural, heavy, as if the very air had shifted into something unfamiliar. Emily could feel it, a strange weight pressing against her chest as she sat curled on the couch, arms wrapped around herself. She cast a glance toward the baby monitor resting on the coffee table, its dim screen glowing faintly in the darkness. Caleb was there, just as he always was, lying still in his crib. And yet, something felt wrong. Zeus had noticed it first. Normally, the Pitbull would be stretched out by the crib, his breathing slow and steady, dozing off but always alert enough to stir if Caleb made the slightest noise. But tonight, Zeus wasn't resting. He wasn't even lying down. Emily's gaze shifted to where he stood, his large muscular frame rigid, ears perked, his eyes fixed on the nursery door. He wasn't growling, not yet, but his entire body was tense, the way a predator might stiffen before a storm. James, noticing her expression, followed her gaze and frowned. "What's wrong with him?" he murmured. Emily shook her head. "I don't know." She had never seen Zeus like this before, not even the night they first brought him home from the shelter, when he had been nervous, unsure, still carrying the scars of whatever life he had endured before finding them. Back then, he had warmed up quickly, as if he understood that this was his home now, as if he knew he was safe. But tonight, Zeus didn't look safe. He looked on edge. Then, without warning, a low, guttural sound rumbled from his throat. Emily stiffened, Did he just... James nodded slowly. Yeah. Zeus was growling. It was low, barely more than a vibration in his chest, but unmistakable. And Zeus never growled. A flicker of unease passed between them. Emily's fingers tightened around the fabric of her sweater as she exchanged a glance with James, her pulse picking up. Something about the way Zeus stood there, unblinking, unmovable, made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Maybe he heard something outside, James suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily wasn't convinced either. Zeus had never reacted like this to a passing car or a distant howl from the neighbor's dog. This was different. Then, without warning, Zeus moved. He bolted toward the nursery, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor as he skidded to a stop just outside Caleb's crib. His tail was stiff, his entire body vibrating with tension. His gaze never wavered from Caleb, his ears twitching as if listening for something beyond human perception. Emily's heart pounded as she stood, her legs moving before her brain could catch up. "Zeus!" she called softly, stepping toward him. He didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge her voice at all. He was locked onto Caleb, his stance unwavering. James was beside her in an instant. "What the hell is he doing?" "I don't know," Emily whispered, a knot forming in her stomach. Then Zeus did something even stranger. He began pacing. Not frantically, not in confusion, but in slow, deliberate circles around the crib, his eyes never leaving Caleb. His nails clicked rhythmically against the floor as he moved, the muscles in his shoulders coiled, his breathing deep and measured. It was almost like he was waiting. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "James, something's not right." James ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed. "I know." Zeus suddenly stopped pacing. Then, in one fluid motion, he leapt onto their bed, the closest elevated surface near the crib, and let out a sharp, resounding bark. The noise shattered the silence, reverberating off the walls, startling both Emily and James. Zeus never barked inside the house. Never. And then, Caleb's tiny fingers twitched. Emily's breath left her in a rush. "James!" "I saw it," he whispered, his voice raw with disbelief. Her hands trembled as she took a step closer to the crib, her pulse thundering in her ears. Caleb remained still for a few moments, just as he always had, just as he had for the past 6 months. But then, there it was again. A small, almost imperceptible movement. His tiny fingers curled ever so slightly before relaxing. It was so subtle that, had they not been watching so closely, they might have missed it. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. Zeus let out another bark, this one softer, as if urging Caleb to keep going. And then, another twitch. Emily turned to James, tears brimming in her eyes. This can't be." James looked just as stunned as she felt. "It's real." Zeus whined softly, nudging the crib with his nose, his excitement barely contained. For 6 months, Caleb had been still. For 6 months, they had been told not to expect change, not to hope for the impossible. And yet, here it was. Something was happening. Something neither of them could explain, and Zeus had known before anyone else. A moment of a miracle, or an unexplainable phenomenon. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her entire body had gone rigid, her fingers tightening instinctively around James's hand. She wasn't even aware of how tightly she was gripping him, wasn't aware of how the blood had drained from her face, how her heartbeat pounded against her ribcage like a trapped bird desperate to escape. All she knew was that she had seen it. Caleb's fingers had moved. It had been faint, barely more than a flicker, a tiny tremor in the vast, motionless stillness that had defined her son's life since the day he was born. And yet, she had seen it. For a moment, the world around her faded. The quiet hum of the baby monitor, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant howl of the wind outside, it all blurred into nothingness. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat, roaring in her ears, drowning out every rational thought. "Did you see that?" she whispered, barely daring to breathe. James didn't answer right away. He stood frozen beside her, his expression torn between disbelief and cautious hope. His hands trembled as he reached out toward the crib, toward Caleb's small, fragile body. He had spent months telling himself not to hope, that expecting a miracle was foolish, that believing in something impossible would only break them further. But now, as his gaze remained locked on their son, a single question echoed in his mind. Had he really seen what he thought he had? Or was exhaustion playing tricks on him? Slowly, he took a step closer. Zeus hadn't moved. The Pitbull remained exactly where he was, standing firm beside the crib, his eyes fixed intently on Caleb. His ears twitched, his breathing slow but steady, his body coiled like a tightly wound spring. He wasn't reacting the way a dog might if he were confused. He wasn't barking in excitement or pacing in nervousness. He was watching, waiting. And James realized something. Zeus wasn't surprised. He knew. As if the dog had sensed it before anyone else, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. James swallowed hard. His chest tightened, his pulse hammering with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and hope. He forced himself to take another step, leaning over the crib now, his breath hitching as he stared down at his son. Caleb was still. His tiny chest rose and fell in its usual steady rhythm. His delicate eyelashes fluttered slightly, his lips slightly parted in sleep. He looked the same as he always had, but then his hand twitched again. A sharp gasp broke from Emily's lips. James staggered back a step, his heart slamming into his ribs. It was unmistakable this time. Caleb's fingers curled into a small, weak fist, then uncurled. Emily let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth. She wanted to believe it, desperately. But how could she? For months, they had watched their son lie motionless. For months, they had been told there was no cure, no hope, that his body would never respond, that nothing could wake the dormant nerves inside him. And yet, tears welled in her eyes as she turned to James. "James, he moved." James didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was too tight, his hands shaking too hard. His mind raced to find an explanation. Maybe it was a muscle spasm, a random reflex. Maybe it didn't mean anything. Maybe. But then Caleb moved again. This time, his entire hand lifted, slow and unsteady, his fingers flexing weakly before dropping back onto the soft fabric beneath him. James stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the crib to steady himself. His breath left him in a sharp exhale, a sound caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. This was real. It wasn't in his head. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't an illusion brought on by exhaustion and desperation. It was real. Caleb had moved. Zeus let out a soft whine, nudging the crib with his nose. His tail twitched, just the faintest sign of excitement, but his eyes never left Caleb. He stood as still as a statue, poised and patient, as if encouraging the child to keep going. Emily dropped to her knees beside the crib, her hands trembling as she reached for her son. Her fingers brushed over his tiny hand, warm and soft beneath her touch. And then, Caleb's fingers wrapped around hers. Emily's breath shattered. A sob tore from her throat, raw and full of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Hope. "James," she choked out, looking up at him, her eyes pleading, desperate for confirmation that she wasn't imagining this. He's holding my hand." James stared down at them, at the tiny, fragile fingers curled around Emily's. His knees nearly gave out beneath him. His son was holding on, not just twitching, not just spasming, holding. James dropped to the floor beside Emily, his hand covering hers, feeling the warmth of Caleb's skin beneath his own. He was shaking so hard he could barely keep his grip steady. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry or collapse under the sheer weight of what was happening. Emily let out another sob, pressing Caleb's hand against her cheek. "My baby," she whispered. "My sweet, strong baby." James swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. He turned to Zeus, who still stood motionless, watching them with quiet intensity, as if he had known all along that this moment was coming, as if he had been waiting for Caleb to wake up. And then, as if responding to some unseen force, Caleb's tiny legs twitched beneath the blanket. James nearly lost his footing. His vision blurred with unshed tears as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Emily gasped sharply, her entire body going still. "James," she whispered, her voice barely more than air. But he had already seen it. Their son had moved, not once, not twice, but again and again. Zeus let out a low, satisfied huff, stepping closer to the crib. His tail wagged slightly now, no longer tense, no longer waiting. James let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. This isn't possible," he murmured. But even as he said it, he knew it was happening. The thing they had been told would never happen, the miracle they had long since given up on, and Zeus had seen it coming before any of them. James turned to Emily, his voice thick with emotion. "We need to call someone." Emily nodded, wiping at her face, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She was too afraid to look away, too afraid that if she blinked, the moment would vanish like a dream. Not yet. Not when their son was still moving. Not when, for the first time in 6 months, she felt like they had finally found a way forward. And as Caleb's tiny fingers curled around hers once more, Emily let herself believe. Believe that this was real. Believe that Caleb was fighting. And believe that, somehow, against all odds, hope had found its way back into their home. The air in the nursery felt different now, charged with an energy neither Emily nor James could fully comprehend. The weight of months of sorrow and helplessness still clung to the walls, but something new was settling in, a fragile, trembling thread of hope. Zeus remained still, his deep brown eyes locked onto Caleb as if he understood the gravity of the moment better than anyone else in the room. His breathing was steady, controlled, his muscular frame tense, yet calm. There was no fear in his gaze, no confusion, only unwavering certainty. Then, with the gentlest of movements, Zeus lowered his head and nudged Caleb's tiny fingers with his wet nose. The softest whimper escaped him, a sound so tender it made Emily's chest tighten. And then, the miracle continued. Caleb's tiny hand twitched, his fingers curling instinctively. A shallow breath hitched in Emily's throat as she watched, afraid to blink, afraid that this delicate movement would disappear if she looked away. And then, Caleb lifted his hand. It was slow, unsteady, barely more than an inch, but it was real. His tiny fingers reached forward, his hand trembling as it hovered in the space between him and Zeus. He was trying. He was fighting. For the first time, he was reaching for something. Zeus remained completely still, his gaze unwavering as he watched Caleb struggle to complete the motion. And then, as if sensing that the boy needed encouragement, Zeus leaned in just a little more, closing the distance. Caleb's fingers brushed against the soft fur on Zeus's snout. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her entire body trembling with emotion. She wanted to believe. She wanted to throw herself into the overwhelming joy threatening to consume her, but a deep-rooted fear held her back. What if this was just a reflex? What if it meant nothing? Tears burned in her eyes as she looked at James, searching for an answer. James was frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the crib so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His jaw clenched, his breath uneven. But his eyes were filled with something Emily hadn't seen in them for a long, long time. Hope. Neither of them spoke, too afraid to shatter the moment, too terrified that even acknowledging it would make it slip away. Zeus, however, had no such fear. The pit bull let out a soft huff, his tail twitching ever so slightly before he leaned in again, gently licking Caleb's tiny fingers. Caleb reacted immediately. His small hand flexed once more, this time more deliberately, his fingers tightening as if trying to grasp something, trying to hold on to the warmth, the presence, the comfort of the creature who had never once left his side. And then, impossibly, Caleb lifted his arm just a little higher. Emily's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her sobs quiet but uncontrollable. Her baby, her son who had never moved, never reached, never grasped for anything, was responding. James let out a shuddering breath, running a hand through his hair as if trying to ground himself. His rational mind was screaming at him to find an explanation, but nothing. No medical reasoning, no scientific logic could make sense of what was happening before his very eyes. Zeus had known. He had sensed something before they did. He had waited, watched, believed, even when they had stopped believing themselves. And now, Caleb was responding to him. The dog's devotion, his unshakable presence, had done something neither of them could understand. Emily wiped at her face, her tears falling freely as she looked up at James, desperate to hear him say something, anything, that could help her process what was happening. James exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's trying, Em." Emily let out a shaky laugh between her tears. "I know." Her fingers trembled as she reached for Caleb's hand, needing to feel his warmth, needing to make sure she wasn't imagining it. But before she could touch him, Caleb's tiny legs twitched beneath the blanket. Emily stopped breathing. James sucked in a sharp gasp. The movement was small, just a barely there flex beneath the soft fabric. But it was there. It was undeniable. Zeus let out another soft whimper, stepping even closer, pressing his nose against Caleb's hand once more. And then, Caleb's leg twitched again. Emily let out a strangled sob. James stumbled back, gripping the nearest piece of furniture to steady himself. He felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting, as if everything they had come to accept over the last 6 months was unraveling in front of them. This wasn't a reflex. This wasn't a meaningless twitch of dormant muscles. This was their son, waking up. Emily reached out with trembling hands, pulling back the blanket, revealing Caleb's small legs. Her fingers hovered over them, too afraid to touch, too afraid to break whatever invisible thread was keeping this moment together. But Caleb moved again, his tiny foot shifting ever so slightly. And then, as if fueled by something unseen, his knee bent just a fraction. Emily collapsed against James, her sobs muffled against his chest. James wrapped his arms around her, his own body shaking as he held onto her, onto the moment, onto the miracle they never thought they'd witness. Zeus let out a quiet, satisfied huff, his tail wagging now, slow and steady, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. He had never doubted, not for a second. And as Caleb's small hand finally, truly gripped onto Zeus's fur, James let out a laugh, a breathless, disbelieving, joyous sound that filled the room. This wasn't just coincidence. This wasn't just luck. This was something more, something unexplainable. Something that had started with the quiet, steadfast love of a dog who had never given up. Zeus had been waiting for Caleb to reach for him, and tonight, for the first time, Caleb had. Emily's hands trembled as she fumbled for the phone, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Her fingers felt clumsy, slipping over the screen as she struggled to tap the number. Her mind was moving too fast, thoughts colliding in a chaotic blur of fear, disbelief, and the desperate need for confirmation. James was already beside her, his own hands shaking as he reached for her wrist, steadying her just enough for her to press the call button. The ringtone buzzed in her ear, each second stretching unbearably long. What if this was temporary? What if it was just a fluke, a cruel trick of fate that would disappear as quickly as it had come? What if they were setting themselves up for heartbreak all over again? She couldn't handle another disappointment. She didn't think she'd survive it. James could see the panic rising in her, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her free hand clutched at her chest as if trying to hold herself together. He placed a firm hand on her back, grounding her, his own heartbeat racing just as wildly. "Breathe, Em," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Just breathe." Then a voice crackled through the receiver. "This is Dr. Reynolds." Emily almost collapsed with relief. She inhaled sharply before forcing the words out, her voice uneven, desperate. "Dr. Reynolds, it's Caleb. He moved." A pause, then a measured response. "Emily, slow down. What do you mean he moved?" James took the phone, his grip tight, his words spilling out in a rush. "His hands, his legs. They're moving, Doc. We saw it. He reached for Zeus. His voice broke on the last word. Another pause, longer this time. "I'm on my way, Doctor," Reynolds finally said. The call ended, but the weight pressing on Emily's chest didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier, because now they had to wait. And waiting meant more time for doubt to creep in. She turned back to the crib, her pulse thundering in her ears. Zeus was still there, unmoving, his large frame planted beside Caleb like a silent guardian. His eyes flicked up briefly to meet hers, as if sensing her turmoil, before returning to the baby. Emily swallowed hard. Caleb was still awake. His tiny fingers were now curled loosely against Zeus's fur, his eyelids fluttering as if he were caught between sleep and wakefulness. His legs, once lifeless for months, shifted again beneath the soft blanket, small, hesitant movements, but unmistakably real. It was happening. It was still happening. James let out a shaky breath beside her. "God, Em, it's not stopping." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't dare blink. Minutes stretched into eternity as they waited, the air thick with a tension neither of them could shake. James paced near the door, rubbing his hands over his face, exhaling in short bursts. What if... He stopped himself, pressing his lips into a thin line. Emily knew what he was about to say. What if it doesn't last? What if this is the peak of his progress, and tomorrow they wake up to find that it was all a fleeting miracle? She shook her head. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't say it." James clenched his jaw but said nothing. A soft whimper pulled their attention back to the crib. Zeus hadn't moved from his spot, but his ears twitched at the sound of a car approaching outside. Dr. Reynolds. James was already moving, throwing the front door open before the doctor had even knocked. The older man stepped inside, his coat still unbuttoned from the rush over, his medical bag clutched tightly in his grip. His sharp eyes flickered over James's face, then Emily's tear-streaked one before settling on Caleb. The tension in the room thickened, the air so fragile it felt like it might crack under the weight of what was about to happen. Without a word, Dr. Reynolds moved toward the crib. Emily held her breath. The doctor's gaze hardened with concentration as he watched Caleb, his experienced hands moving swiftly as he checked the child's pulse, his muscle tone, his reflexes. Then, Caleb's hand moved again. Emily let out a small gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Dr. Reynolds's fingers froze mid-examination. His expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, something close to disbelief. He pressed gently against Caleb's legs, testing. Caleb responded. A sharp inhale came from the doctor. He tried again. A little more pressure this time, and Caleb's tiny foot kicked weakly against his palm. Dr. Reynolds slowly straightened, his face unreadable. He exhaled, long and measured, before finally speaking. This... He hesitated, his eyes flicking between the baby and the expectant parents. Should not be possible. Emily clutched James's arm, her entire body trembling. But James didn't waver. His voice, though rough, was steady when he spoke. It's happening. Zeus let out a quiet huff, his tail wagging slightly. And for the first time in 6 months, someone who wasn't Emily or James looked at Caleb and saw a future. Dr. Reynolds stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Caleb as though he were trying to make sense of something impossible. His hands, trained by years of medical experience, had performed thousands of examinations before, but never one quite like this. Emily and James watched him anxiously, their breath held as if the very air in the room had become too fragile to disturb. Zeus, ever vigilant, remained beside Caleb, his watchful eyes never leaving the baby. The Pitbull's body was relaxed, yet there was an unmistakable intensity in his presence, as if he already knew what the doctor was only just beginning to discover. Dr. Reynolds finally exhaled, shifting his medical bag onto the floor as he knelt beside the crib. His fingers moved expertly, pressing lightly against Caleb's limbs, testing for any reaction. His gaze was sharp, calculating, his mind undoubtedly racing through every medical scenario that could explain what he was witnessing. "Caleb," he murmured softly, more to himself than to the baby. Then he pressed gently against the bottom of Caleb's foot. For months, there had been nothing. No movement, no reflex, no sign of life beyond the rise and fall of the baby's chest. But now... Caleb's toes curled ever so slightly. Dr. Reynolds stiffened, his brows furrowing deeply. He pressed again, this time applying a little more pressure. A small but unmistakable twitch. Emily let out a gasp, her hands gripping James's arm so tightly he thought she might bruise him. The doctor said nothing, his expression unreadable as he adjusted his approach. He ran his fingers lightly down the length of Caleb's legs, pausing at key points to test nerve responses. At every checkpoint, every place that should have yielded nothing, there was now a reaction. Small, weak, but undeniably real. Dr. Reynolds sat back slightly, rubbing his chin, his mind visibly churning through the implications of what he had just observed. This, he hesitated, as if struggling to put words to what he was thinking, shouldn't be happening. James's breath hitched. But it is. The doctor nodded slowly. It is. Emily wiped at her face, her emotions teetering between joy and sheer disbelief. What does it mean? She whispered. Dr. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his stethoscope, placing it gently against Caleb's chest. He listened intently, his features unreadable, before finally moving on to check the baby's grip strength. When he placed his finger in Caleb's palm, something extraordinary happened. Caleb squeezed. It wasn't strong, not yet, but it was there, a conscious, deliberate response. Dr. Reynolds leaned back on his heels, shaking his head in silent amazement. Emily couldn't take it anymore. "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Tell us what's happening." Dr. Reynolds looked up at her, his expression softening. "Emily," he said carefully, "your son is showing signs of neurological activity that, according to every scan and examination we've done, shouldn't be possible." James ran a hand through his hair, his heart hammering. "But it is possible," he said, his voice almost defiant. The doctor nodded slowly. "Yes, and I don't have a medical explanation for it." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of those words pressing down on all of them. For months, they had been told there was nothing to be done. that Caleb's condition was irreversible. That hope was not something they could afford to have. Yet here they were. Caleb had moved. He had responded. He had fought back. Emily's gaze flickered to Zeus, still poised beside the crib, his tail wagging slightly now, as if he had been waiting for them to catch up. Something about it made her chest tighten. She turned back to Dr. Reynolds, her voice barely above a whisper. What if... She hesitated, swallowing hard. What if this wasn't just medical? The doctor's eyes flicked toward the Pitbull, following her line of sight. He studied Zeus for a moment, something unreadable flashing across his face. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know this. He turned back to them, his voice firm. Your son has a chance. A real one. James reached for Emily's hand, gripping it tightly. For the first time in 6 months, those words didn't feel empty. They felt real. And for the first time, they let themselves believe. The days that followed were nothing short of remarkable. Each morning, Emily and James woke up with equal parts excitement and disbelief, watching as Caleb continued to defy every expectation set against him. What started as small twitches soon became more deliberate movements. His fingers, once limp and unresponsive, now curled and flexed with intent. His legs, which had never shown any sign of life before, now kicked softly beneath his blanket. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't sudden. But it was happening. And through it all, Zeus never left his side. The Pitbull had always been a silent guardian, but now, more than ever, he was Caleb's shadow. He lay beside the crib every night, his warm body a constant source of comfort. During the day, he watched over Caleb with quiet determination, as if ensuring the boy never lost the strength to keep going. He wasn't just a pet. He was something more, something Emily and James couldn't quite explain, but deeply understood. The bond between them had always been there, but now it had become undeniable. It was as if Zeus had seen something in Caleb that no one else had, believed in something when no one else dared to. And maybe, just maybe, that belief had been enough to change everything. News of Caleb's unexpected progress quickly spread beyond their home. Dr. Reynolds, still baffled by the events he had witnessed, shared the story cautiously among his colleagues. He was careful not to call it a miracle, not in the way people usually did, but he admitted that science had no answer for what had happened. A miracle of love, he finally called it, shaking his head in amazement. The story made its way through the community, and soon people were talking not just about Caleb, but about Zeus. For years, Pitbulls had carried an unfair reputation, misunderstood, feared, judged without reason. But Zeus had become living proof that love had nothing to do with breed, nothing to do with appearances. People who once crossed the street to avoid dogs like him now looked at Zeus with something different in their eyes. Admiration, respect. He wasn't just a dog. He was a protector, a healer, a friend. And in a way no one could explain, he had helped bring Caleb back to life. One quiet afternoon, as the golden light of sunset spilled through the nursery window, Emily sat in the rocking chair, cradling Caleb in her arms. He was awake, his big eyes blinking sleepily up at her, his tiny fingers wrapped loosely around hers. She pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, breathing him in, letting the warmth of him settle into her soul. "You're so strong," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And all of this is because of Zeus." At her feet, the Pitbull lifted his head, his dark eyes warm and knowing. Slowly, Zeus moved closer, resting his head on Caleb's tiny lap. He let out a deep, contented sigh, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. And maybe he had. Emily smiled through her tears, running her fingers gently through Zeus's fur. "Thank you," she murmured. Zeus didn't respond, not in words at least, But as he lay there, his breathing slow and steady, his presence as unwavering as ever, Emily knew. Somehow he already understood. And in that moment, as Caleb drifted off to sleep, safe and warm in her arms, Emily knew one more thing to be true. Love, pure, unconditional love, could overcome anything. The story of Caleb and Zeus is more than just an extraordinary tale. It's a testament to the power of love, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. It reminds us that miracles don't always come in the form of medical breakthroughs or grand gestures. Sometimes they come in the quiet presence of a devoted companion, in the steadfast belief that hope is never truly lost. Zeus saw something in Caleb long before anyone else did. He never gave up, never wavered, and in doing so, he awakened something deep within the little boy, the will to fight, to move, to live. This story is not just about a dog and a child. It's about the unseen bonds that heal us, the love that transcends logic, and the simple truth that sometimes the strongest medicine isn't found in hospitals. It's found in the hearts that refuse to stop believing. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.